Good morning. My name is Valerie Nepper. I'm with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and we're here to talk about parking policies. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the session today, and I'll be introducing all the speakers. I want to tell you the speakers that we have today have international, national, and local experience, so there's a lot of experience there, and they're open to your questions and comments here. We will be engaging, after a brief introduction, we'll be engaging in a series of 4 workshops, or 4 presentations and discussions on some of the key issues in parking policy with Jeff Tomlin of Nelson Nygaard. We'll take a 15-minute break around 10:30, depending on exactly how we get there. We'll then reconvene to hear from Matt Tacker about a city planner perspective on actually implementing parking policies. And then we will hear from Mott Smith on a developer's perspective on parking policies and housing. We'll then move into a full discussion about all the presentation materials, your questions, your comments, and really try to think about how to move forward. We plan to be out of here by noon, and we only have 1 break scheduled, so if you want to get up and move around, do so. There's restrooms outside here, so feel free to get up and move around, and we will have food in at that break. These presentations will all be, we're being taped. This will be posted online. There's also materials that have been developed. There's technical reports have been developed. I put out display copies on the side here. Those are all available online here. I didn't want to kill too many trees and making too much paper, but it's all available online. If you have any problems with accessing it online, I'd be happy to get you copies of the reports. Just let me know. So it's all available over there. And please do make sure to sign in, because we will be coming back to you with a survey asking about what you thought about the workshop, as well as how to move forward. We want your ideas about how to continue in this process here. So why does MTC care about parking policies, and what's our role? Clearly, parking policies are part of local land use decision-making process. Why does MTC care? Because the collection of local parking policies have a regional impact. They impact development opportunities, they impact housing prices throughout the region, they impact small business viability, they impact vehicle miles of travel and greenhouse gases. These are all things that MTC cares about. We have goals, and we are developing strategies to try to meet those goals as per SB 375 and other regional goals. So we care a lot about these things, and clearly they're in the local purview, and we're trying to help you here. So our role is primarily one of offering technical assistance and support and guidance. When we do fund studies such as stationary plans, priority development plans, we look for analysis of parking and access policies and consideration of alternative policies here. Clearly, the cities are dealing with a lot right now. We have high travel expenses, tumultuous housing market, changing demographics, severe environmental concerns, and unprecedented fiscal challenges, that probably being the biggest thing. Everybody's concerned about how do we get the economy back and running, how do we get our own city back and running here. And one of the things we want to talk about is the importance of parking policies for making your downtown and your city center work better. The traditional practice has been for public agencies to provide parking, oftentimes free, and to require developers to provide large amounts of parking. And these were well-intentioned policies, but they've oftentimes had unexpected negative implications that do not necessarily serve what we're trying to do in terms of creating vibrant downtowns and affordable housing for people. So this regional effort is trying to help localities rethink their parking policies. It came out of the work we did for transit-oriented development, where we'd go out to cities and talk about transit-oriented development, and the biggest issue we heard about was parking. We'd love to do higher density development, we'd like to do more infill, but we can't find places for the cars, we can't do this because of parking. Everybody agrees parking is a huge problem. Everybody disagrees about what it is here. So the idea is to bring more experience and more facts and more case studies, and hopefully some inspiration for you in terms of looking at what can be done, what has been successful in other places, to help you with the challenging job of addressing the parking policies in your own community. It takes courage and hard work to make changes, And parking policies have been kind of in a direction for quite some time, and we're looking to rethink them to have a broader perspective on how they can serve your needs better. So we hope that at the end of this session, you'll have some more resources to work with. One of the things the last session we have is, or the last segment of this workshop, is really asking you, what can we do to help you more? We hear from cities a number of concerns like, we can't change our parking policies, or we cannot afford to not provide free parking because the next city down the road provides free parking, so we need to. That's a place where we start thinking maybe there's a regional role somehow, but obviously we respect your local land use authority, so we're trying to figure out how to assist local jurisdictions in addressing these parking issues. We'll have a brief welcome by Tom Bates. Many of you probably know Tom Bates. He's had a lifetime of public service, most recently with the City of Berkeley as the mayor, but before that, 2 decades as a California legislator. While in the State Assembly, he supported an array of progressive policies, including introducing the original legislation creating transit-oriented developments. As a mayor, he promotes smart growth along the main streets in the city, at the same time preserving and protecting the neighborhoods, which is, of course, a tricky balance, but one that he's addressed very well as mayor. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tom Bates.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for inviting me to come. Excuse me. As Valerie indicated, I'm the current mayor of the city of Berkeley. I've been there now for 10 years. But I actually got interested in what I call transit villages when I was in the legislature in the 1995, 94, 93, in those years. I introduced a bill which at the time was sort of revolutionary. It was a notion of establishing transit villages, and the idea was that they wanted to make those near transit stations and transportation hubs, and it would be within a quarter of a mile. And if you lived within that quarter of a mile, you had certain benefits. So we transferred stuff from the redevelopment agency, could come in there, and the idea was that you would have a situation where people would have at least 10,000 people living close to transportation, and they wouldn't need a car. They might want a car, they might have a car, but they wouldn't need a car because you'd have enough people there to be able to have all the services that are necessary for them to be able to have wonderful lives. Well, since I became the mayor of Berkeley, I thought, well, I should try to implement this plan. So that's what we've been trying to do. And I can say that over the last 10 years, it's not all because of me, but obviously the prior mayor, we have actually seen the city of Berkeley grow by almost 10,000 people, over 10,000 people. So we've grown by 9.5%, and that growth has taken place, almost all of it, around transit-oriented development. So I'm very proud of that fact because it's actually worked. So in the process, parking becomes really a major concern, a major issue. When I was elected mayor, the city had a policy, and the policy is still in effect, which says that you cannot add any more parking spaces than existed in the year, I think it was 1998. That was it. That policy has been an interesting policy because we've seen development take place on vacant lots. So we sort of have an opportunity to say, well, we've got this many parking spaces we can afford to add in the future. We also have major entertainment, obviously, in Berkeley. There are people come there. We have over 300, almost 350 restaurants, if you can believe, and people come from all over the world to Berkeley. They come to the university, come to the restaurants and things. And as a consequence, we have a major entertainment venues: the Repertory Theater, the Aurora Theater, the Freight and Salvage, Berkeley Community Theater. I mean, it's possible that we could have a perfect storm where we could have every parking space in the whole city, a big game or something going on at the same time, and you couldn't find a parking place anywhere. Now, the people of Berkeley are probably like the people in your community. So what they really want to do, they want to find a place on the street, a parking space on the street with a broken meter, right? With a broken meter. That would be ideal for them. But we have decided that we're going to try to put in policies in place that encourage people to use for public transportation or to walk or to bicycle or to get there by other means than a car. And as a consequence, it has been in place for quite a while is the requirement that you have to provide when you build a new building, 1,000 square feet for every residential unit. You'd have to provide one car parking. Now you can get out of that. Now what that means, 1 per 1,000 square feet. I don't know of any apartments, maybe in your communities, they're building apartments that are 1,000 square feet or more, but in our community, they're building them like at 650 and 400, now they're talking about 350. So that means it's way more than one per one. It's not just one unit, one car. We also have now put in place provisions that I think I'm very proud of, because it comes right out of the philosophy that I have, which is every new building, every new commercial mixed-use building has to provide bicycle parking. Is required to provide on-site some kind of car share, either city car share, zip car, some kind of car share that has to be available to people. They also have to provide a bus pass for everybody who lives there, every unit, and this not only in residential, but this is also in commercial. So anytime you build an office building or you build a new unit, you gotta provide a bus pass. There's the development when you come into Berkeley on University on the right-hand side, the southern side, 4th and U. It's a huge development that took place there, right by the railroad track. And the people, when they were going through the approval process, I said, you got to provide a parking pass. And they were sort of reluctant to do that, but they said, okay, if that's what it takes, we'll do that. And then interestingly enough, once they got it built, it became like their number one sales point was this pass, because people could get this free bus pass, right? They paid for it in their rent. Free bus pass. They could go up on University Avenue and catch a bus, and they could be in San Francisco in no time at all. They can catch a bus. They could be downtown Berkeley, or they could be elsewhere. And people, we required one bus pass per unit to be free. And then they negotiated with AC Transit to say, no, we want to have one for the other person who lives in this unit. Can we get another deal on that? So that actually has been very encouraging that that's happened. But now it's required on all of our buildings that go forward. And we also, would love to figure out a way with BART, and it's very frustrating with us with BART, because BART, charges for the distance traveled. So where an AC Transit pass, you can go anywhere with that AC Transit pass, but BART, it's a different charge. So we haven't been able to work that out. I'm hoping that we can do that in the future. The other thing we do is we say you cannot bundle parking in a new structure. In other words, you can't say if the rent is $450 or $1,200 and you get a free parking space. No. That parking space has to be charged separately from the unit. So that's also been something that we've been interested to do. And then the neighbors all around there say, oh my God, you're going to put all these people in here, you're not going to have any parking. Tom, they're going to drive, right? They're not going to not drive. So what we did was we said we have preferential parking in Berkeley, so you get a permit, right? Just park on the street. You can't park on the street. And we said any new building that's built, any resident in that building will not be eligible for a parking permit. So that kind of eased a little bit of the pain. And then the other really interesting thing to me is some of the developers came along with an idea that helped them from a cost standpoint, which is stacked parking. A developer in Berkeley by the name of Patrick Kennedy had this idea, where you could stack 3 cars, and so you save a lot of space, and it worked, and people adjusted to it. It particularly worked because the people who lived in the units were the ones who used it, and they knew how to operate it. I mean, they knew how to. It wasn't like you have a situation where people aren't familiar with the material, how to make the actual garage lift work. So that has been something that's been successful. Now, when I walk around and I look and I go into the garages of these brand new buildings, these buildings that have been built, there's been over 300 low-income housing has been built for seniors and others, and over 400 housing has been built for working people who are low and moderate income have been built in the city. So over the 3,000 units or so that were built in the last 10 years. So I go into these places, and guess what? there is all kinds of vacancies in these garages. There are all kinds of vacancies. Even though we've allowed them to get out of it, we've allowed them to pay out of it, we've allowed them to, not provide it if they make a payment to the city of parking, and there's still tons of parking that's not being used. So we now have a development. I'll give you an example. A developer's coming forward, and they want to build a major project, 205 units, and it's in the process of being the approval process. So it's not like it's a done deal, but and I'm still obviously, as any elected official, I have to keep an open mind, right, until I actually see the project. So I'm definitely keeping an open mind on this. But here's what they're saying: 205 units. Now it's close to the University of California. It's on University. It's right by BART. They want to provide 50 parking spaces, 50. And some people are saying that's probably too much. But so the whole issue is obviously the cost of providing parking. The question is, what are the alternatives? Like when Berkeley is not your city, so you may not have the transportation situation we do. You may not have a BART. You may not have an AC transit right there in a hub, where you can tier off that. But the point is, to me, parking is absolutely key. And the problem, we're doing everything we can in the city of Berkeley, and myself personally, around climate change, global warming. And if we're ever going to make a difference in this area, transportation is the major, in our city, over 50% of the greenhouse gas comes from the transportation sector. So we're trying to do everything we can possibly do to get people not to use the car. Let me tell you about one other thing, and then I'll be glad to have a few moments. I'll be happy to answer some questions before I have to leave. We started an idea that I had, which we were successfully able to get funded, thanks to MTC and the Air District, which was to say, let's look at some of our residential areas in Berkeley, where we have these, particularly the Elmwood area, which is College and Ashby and that area, and Telegraph, and Shattuck, and let's see if we can figure out a way to get people who work in Berkeley, because our situation is we have a huge influx every day of people who work in Berkeley. We have much greater input than we do output. It's almost, I think I've heard the figure 20,000 that come in, that the net is 20,000 in. So the idea was to try to figure out how we could help people who work here to be able to have other choices. So the grant is underway, and you guys should watch it and see what happens. The first thing is in this grant is, this sounds draconian, but I think it's the key, is license plate recognition. Are you guys familiar with license plate recognition? Well, we're getting some license plate recognition. So this means if you're parked in a residential permitted area, right, this is in the residence, what people have learned is they just go out and move their car from one block to the next block, or else they just go out and wipe the chalk off, and they're home free for another couple hours. So license plate recognition obviously sees the license plate, says you're there, records it. If you move it within the area, you move your car, you're still within the 2-hour zone, you're going to get a ticket. So it's much more difficult. This hasn't quite started, so I'm trying to make this program not start till after the next election. No, we're going to start it as soon as we can. But anyway, well, those people are all coming to Berkeley. They're not Berkeley residents, so it's okay. No, but in any case, it's going to be very difficult to move your car. It's going, so you can do it, but man, it's going to be tough. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, what we're saying to them is, we're working with Transform and others to show them travel choice, to start telling them what alternatives are available to them, how they can get here by using public transportation. And in addition to that, we're going to be able to provide them with a bus pass. If they agree to take, not drive once or twice a week or 3 times a week, they get a free bus pass. Then they say, well, gosh, what happens if my kid gets sick or something and I got to go and I don't have my car? We have a program that you guys may be familiar with, Guaranteed Ride Home. I hope it's going to be as good as it sounds, but it would be available to people. In addition to that, we're putting car shares all over the place. We're putting car shares so that they're now in various locations around the city. We're going to be able to have them in this area, concentrate for people who want to, have a problem come up. they get a free membership in car share, and they get an opportunity to use a car share. So if I'm there and something comes up, or I'm at work and I need to go to San Leandro, or I need to go someplace, I can get a car, and I can get it easily. We started out in Berkeley, and now we have almost over 100 city car shares, or cars, zip cars, and other kinds of public and nonprofit and for-profit car shares. So that's a big emphasis, to try to get people to do this. Now, if people in the community, if you give up your car, like I did, gave up a car about 3 years ago. We're going to have car shares in the community. So people who give up a car will have a free car share for at least a year, and they'll be able to drive it a year. So that means that second car that's sitting there, that you never use, it's going to be able to, not have to have it around, because there'll be a car share. So we're trying to do what we can to be as creative as we possibly can be around these issues. So I would encourage you to, from the standpoint of development, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be here, because I'd love to hear Jeff's commentary, because what we're struggling with now, just to point it out to you, is we say, okay, you got to do all these things. You got to put bicycles, you got to put car shares, you got to put electricity in there to charge new cars, you got to provide a bus pass, you got to do this, you got to do that. And then they say, the city said, well, guess what? You can also, if you want to pay us, it costs you like $30,000 to build that garage, that space for that garage, but if you will give us like 15 or 10 or 20 or something, you don't have to build it. And Jeff and I were talking briefly about it, and he thinks that's something I should rethink. That it'd be much better just to have an assessment, an impact assessment, and not worry about that. So I'm going to rethink that and have a chance to think about that, because we're in the process now of actually putting together our fees, some of our fee issues around our downtown. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that, as I started out by telling you about all these people coming to Berkeley, and coming to Berkeley they are, and that's good. That's a good thing. We have a garage that actually the city owns 3 garages, and we have one garage that needs to be, it's not earthquake safe, it needs to be torn down. And we're now trying to figure out how we can work that garage in and build it and accomplish some of the objectives that we want to have. We have, in the mornings, we have a major YMCA in downtown Berkeley that just does an amazing job, and they need about 300 parking spaces from 6 in the morning till about 9 in the morning. The community college across the street, they have their instructors, they say they need like 30 or 40 spaces just for their instructors and staff. Then there's students, and now Peralta provides a bus pass, so that's helpful. But the students, they're there. Then the Repertory Theater, when it's sold out, and the Aurora and the Sprayton Salvage are going on, they need lots of parking. So we need parking in the evening. So we're going to have to figure out how we can use all of the new techniques to be able to determine demand, when there's vacancies, how we can utilize those vacancies, how we can, move them around so that we can make sure that people have a chance to have a place to park. And then lastly, we were knocking on wood. There's a real possibility that we're going to get a major hotel downtown, and they're on site where they're looking, they can't get enough parking. I mean, there's just not enough parking. And if you start going down, first floor is not so expensive, but the second floor down is really expensive. And if you went third floors down, it's like prohibitive. So they want to figure out how they can have valet parking for another 100. Or another 100 cars that they would want to valet, which are different times. So it's trying to figure out all this time management stuff to make it all work. So it's going to be an interesting few months for me. Let me just conclude by saying I think that if I had my druthers and I could wave a magic wand, I would say Berkeley would not require any parking spaces for anybody. And the developers would love that, the neighbors would freak out, and the people around there would freak out. The merchants would say that's not feasible, but I think that we're trying to get people to realize that we have opportunities for people to come. We want to make those opportunities available to them. I should mention one last, I'm sorry, unless I forgot. In our pilot project, we're also going to experiment with demand parking. I'm calling it something else, but the prices will vary depending upon the time of day. So I think we need to be smart. We need to get our parking in a way that allows people to be able to come, that there vacancies so people can park, so they don't have to circle. We need to use the technology, which the University of California is now engaging with us on, about how you can know where a spot is available, where you can reserve a spot so you don't have to drive around looking for a spot. And we need to build it in a way, allow builders to build it in a way around transportation where they really don't need to provide the parking. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain any questions. If I had to buy my druthers, that's what I would like. What we know is that the market, well, I don't know this for a fact. Jeff and others are more knowledgeable about this, but what I've been told is that in apartments, there's the lenders and people like that who are not too upset about not having parking. But when you start talking about condominiums, it's a different situation. The lenders say, you know, you've got to provide parking. We hope that we actually have only, well, we've had several projects. What they do is they go in and get a condo, and then they start out as a rental, and then want to switch over. So it's going to be hard to switch over, but by and large, we haven't run into that problem at this point around condos. So in other words, you know, the market would say you got to provide it. If you got to provide it, yeah. And I would be okay with that. I mean, if you couldn't finance it any other way, then that way you'd have to provide the parking. I would. In other words, we don't say you can't. In fact, there's a group of people who would say and I might think about joining them. Would say you can't provide over X number of spaces. You know, that's it. You're prohibited from providing more than 1 per 1,000 square feet. Is there another question here? Yes. You have to speak way loud. I'm sorry.
Okay. The city of Berkeley is known as being rather unique. And have you had any resistance to sharing these ideas? Have you been successful in trying to normalize the Berkeley experience? Like, oh, well, they do it in X city as well, so it's not just us in Berkeley.
Well, you guys all know you're here at this conference. Parking is just, you know, there are people who love it and people who hate it, right? And there are people who want more and there are people who want none. And so there's all extreme. I think the only thing I can really tell you about, you know, from my experience being an elected official in Berkeley for, you know, 30 plus years, what happens in Berkeley a lot of times, you know, will happen elsewhere. It's sort of a laboratory city. It's one of those cities that pushes the envelope. Sometimes it's a good idea. Sometimes it's a great idea. I think that the notion of providing bus passes as a condition of giving rent is a great idea. I think that's going to go everywhere. I don't know why it wouldn't. Particularly, obviously, you got to have the conditions in order to have it work. But I think that's something that's clearly there. The idea of providing, you know, the city car shares and all of that, you know, electric outlets, because we're going to have more and more electric cars, hopefully, in the future, about having bicycle parking and making it more friendly. All those ideas, I think, are all mainstream, or are almost all mainstream. So I think that what happens in Berkeley, a lot of times you just need to look at. I think this plan that I'm telling you, this pilot that we're underway with license plate recognition, city car shares, passes, all that, that'll be amazing. We'll see how that works out, because if that works here, it can work anywhere, because the principles are transferable. So thank you very much. I've got to go back to the city. We have a few issues that I need to attend to, not the least of which are people who are sitting outside here. No, we're doing a sit ordinance. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So with that, we're actually going to walk through a lot of the issues that he mentioned kind of quickly. Jeff Tumlin is a principal at Nelson Nygaard. He has a great deal of experience internationally, nationally, as well as with a lot of Bay Area cities about transit-oriented development, about sustainability, about parking policies. So he's going to walk us through 4 modules with presentations and discussions of each of those. Jeff?
Thanks, Valerie. So once again, I'm Jeff Tumlin with Nelson Nygaard in San Francisco. And I do transportation planning all over the country and various places around the world. And in my experience, what I've found is that particularly in these challenging economic times when cities don't have a lot of money to be spending on things, that there's no more cost-effective way of achieving your housing affordability, economic development, social equity, quality of life, ecological sustainability, and a whole array of other public policy goals than getting smarter about parking. And as Mayor Bates knows, and as many of you who've tried to change your parking policies know, there's also no better way of getting angry phone calls to your desk or making your reelection more challenging than getting smarter about parking. So we're going to go through a bunch of material here very quickly. I'm going to start off with a 10-minute presentation. It's basically a primer on parking. We'll take some questions. Then we'll talk a little bit about minimum parking requirements. More Q&A, a little bit about parking structures, and finally a bit about parking management. So why do parking policies matter? Well, it touches almost everything that we do in trying to run and manage cities, trying to better our economy, and trying to create a fairer society. And it touches our lives as well as residents. We care a lot about parking. We want a parking space right at our home. We want a space right in front of our home for our guests. And yet we also want to live in a leafy, walkable neighborhood and not next to a giant parking lot. As business owners, we also want a space right in front of our store for our customers. We need good parking for our employees in order to attract and retain our employees. And we also want for many of us, our business to be located in a walkable and interesting environment in order to be able to attract more customers. And we don't want a giant parking lot next to us that makes it more difficult to walk there, but we want a lot of parking. As a developer, we want a predictable approvals process. We want to make sure that we've got enough parking spaces in order to be able to attract tenants and buyers. But we don't want too many parking spaces so that it makes it infeasible to finance our development project. But we want enough parking spaces so that the lenders will actually give us money in order to be able to build it. As cities, we want to make sure that we've got enough parking spaces in our mixed-use areas and our neighborhoods in order to keep our residents happy and in order to ensure that people can continue to shop in our downtowns. But we also don't want too much parking because it's expensive and it takes up a lot of land and it takes away opportunities for other kinds of revenue-producing and vitality-producing development. Similarly, as transit agencies, we want enough parking so that people who are living in more auto-dependent areas can have access to transit. But we have to be very careful about how much parking we provide. One, because it's expensive, and two, because surrounding our transit stops with parking means that we can't surround our transit stops with transit-oriented development. That parking is a great way of attracting riders who are in auto-dependent locations, but it's expensive, and it precludes our ability to create transit-oriented development and development-oriented transit. Similarly, as regional agencies, we see that there's a strong relationship between how we provide parking for housing and our ability to achieve our regional housing affordability goals. There's also a relationship between how much parking we provide and how we manage that parking and our ability to achieve our regional congestion management, air quality, and CO2 reduction goals. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Parking also influences the design of our communities. This is, we will not tell you where this location is. It could be anywhere here in the Bay Area, but you can see that this is a mixed-use development project. There's some office, there's some housing down there in the lower right-hand corner, there's some retail in the lower left corner, there's also a transit stop just off the image in the top left. But you can see that in this community, where parking is provided based upon standard minimum parking requirements, that if you wanted to go from that office building in the middle to the restaurant across the street, you would probably get in your car and drive across the street. In many ways, the way we provide minimum parking requirements and parking management techniques creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of automobile dependency and increased congestion and air pollution. It also consumes a lot of land. And so if those are the roadways, that's how much parking our requirements require us to consume in our land area, setting aside far more land for our automobiles than we do for our citizens. Parking is also a big factor in influencing our day-to-day choices about how we get around. People make very rational decisions about how to get from A to B. A lot of it based upon travel time, some of it based upon price. And so if I need to go a mile in order to get a quart of milk, I've got maybe many options available to me. If I decided to walk, that would be free, but it would probably take me about 20 minutes. And the walk, depending upon where I'm at, may not be a very nice walk. If I wanted to take the bus or the train, maybe it would only take me 15 minutes, but it's going to cost me $2 each way. You know, that's maybe more than the quart of milk is going to cost me. If I were to ride my bike, that's also going to be free, and it may only take 10 minutes, and I can come and go whenever I want. But maybe the bike facilities aren't so great, or it's raining, or I need to carry a lot of stuff. Whereas if I'm going to be driving, I can come and go whenever I want, and it's maybe only going to take me 5 minutes. And from my perspective of somebody just getting in my car, it may seem to be free, even if it's actually costing me something, because I've already paid for the gas and the insurance. Parking also has a large bearing on housing affordability, and Mott Smith will talk to you more about these relationships later today. But for every parking space that we require in a residential unit, it increases the cost of that unit by at least 10%. And it reduces the number of units that we can build in a typical parcel. So while many of our parking requirements are very well intended, they have a whole set of negative, unintended consequences that we need to think about as we decide how to require and manage our parking spaces. So what goes into creating a parking space? Well, the first thing that you need to start off with is a chunk of land. And we'll ignore land costs for a moment and just talk about construction costs. A simple surface parking lot costs about $5,000 per space. If you want to add structures, you want to add levels to that, above ground, figure about $25,000 per space. Costs vary a lot in this region. We've seen much higher costs and some that are a little bit lower, but that's a typical rule of thumb. Below ground, it's going to cost you more, typically about $35,000 per space, and depending upon soil conditions, can go upward dramatically from there. But even though parking is expensive, we still find in almost all communities that people believe, because, I don't know, it's in the Second Amendment or Leviticus somewhere, that parking shall be free. So what do we do about this? Well, one of the things that we need to do about this is recognize that communities are changing, and particularly demographics. In many cities that were built in the post-war era, where we assumed that all families were alike and that all trips realistically needed to be by car, it was reasonable to oversupply parking and ensure that parking would be free, because it's a pain to be able to pay for parking. However, oversupplying parking and making parking free for everyone is just a shift of economic priorities. That parking still needs to be paid for. In our current practice, what we do is we charge everyone in order to be able to provide that parking for the people who choose to drive. In places where everyone drives, this is reasonably equitable, but in places where there are young people or old people, or people who don't want to drive, or low-income people, we're taxing all of those people in order to be able to subsidize driving for people who choose to drive. And as our demographics change, as people get older, which we're seeing dramatically as the baby boomers are moving into retirement, and as young people are less interested in driving because it cuts them off from their social networks, or baby boomers who are interested for public health and personal preference reasons in more walkable communities, that there is an increasing demand for prioritizing walkability and livability over the convenience of the automobile. And so it's not to say that no one will want to drive or that we should eliminate all parking, merely that the balance in our society is shifting a little bit in favor of managing parking more intelligently and thinking in a more sophisticated way of what the demand truly is for parking. The trick here is to give people a choice. Matt Tacker from Diambachu will talk later about his experience working in the city of Berkeley. A great example there is the Gaia building, which got out of its minimum parking requirements, provided relatively few parking spaces, and very critically unbundled parking, so that people with 4 cars could buy 4 parking spaces for those cars, and households with 0 cars could afford more housing and less parking. The result of that was a lot less parking demand. And the result of that is a lot of residents who are driving less and can afford more housing. We typically decide upon setting our minimum parking requirements based upon very limited data. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next section, typically copying them out of the parking generation manual or just inheriting them from previous generations. But what we find when we go and look at the data is that parking demand varies far more by location than it does by land use type. And it also, like all other commodities in our society, demand is influenced by the availability of choices and, critically importantly, by price. So what works in downtown Oakland may not make any sense in Montclair. So why do we treat parking as if it were something that everyone needed? If, for example, we realize that, for me, it's far more important for me to have my coffee in the morning than it is to have my parking space in order to get to work. And yet we don't have minimum zoning requirements for Starbucks on every corner, nor do we set minimum production thresholds so that all coffee is free in order to ensure that our citizens are productive. And yet we do exactly this for parking. We don't say that there is a minimum, a 2-drink beer minimum requirement for every pizza that is sold, and yet we do this for parking. And so what I would argue is that, yes, in fact, the market will likely do a better job at figuring out what the optimal supply of parking is for the whole array of development conditions that exist out there, and the different types of families and households and employers that exist out there, and that we need to think of parking like we think of other commodities in our society, whether it be food or water or our cell phones or airplane tickets, and manage parking as the incredibly valuable, space-consuming, complicated resource that it is. That we need to allow for more personal choice, that we need to allow for people to choose how to spend money on their own personal priorities, and to accommodate more walkable, more urban environments in order to achieve our larger economic development, sustainability, quality of life, and social equity goals. So with that, I'm happy to take a few questions before we move on to minimum parking requirements. Yes, ma'am.
Why have any zoning at all then?
Well, there are many good reasons to provide zoning for all sorts of things. So we provide zoning in order to achieve specific social goods. So for example, you can zone in order to make sure that you don't have a tanning plant in a residential neighborhood. You can zone in order to make sure that the character of buildings is compatible with a given neighborhood. I'm not sure, however, that we need to zone for parking in many situations. The developers will, in fact, likely provide an optimal amount of parking for their project without government needing to interfere in that market. In fact, in many communities, rather than zoning for minimum parking requirements in order to ensure that parking is oversupplied, they actually establish instead maximum parking allowances in order to reduce their traffic congestion, improve quality of life in residential neighborhoods and in commercial districts, and to achieve their traffic congestion and CO2 and air quality goals.
Seems that when parking isn't provided on site, the parking demand goes onto the street and really pushes that responsibility onto the public agency to maintain, manage, restore the equity. It's not necessarily going away unless people stop driving. So it seems that although you eliminate the parking requirement, how do you make sure that doesn't roll over and become a public problem that we have to then by having to manage through permit issuance or parking restrictions, curb striping? How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
You cannot achieve a parking availability goal by focusing entirely on the supply side. Like all other goods in our society, we need to look at both the supply and the demand side of the equation. If in your community, as a result of your minimum parking requirements, you have plenty of off-street parking availability, as is true in most cities, except for maybe in the absolute core of your downtown, requiring more off-street parking construction when you already have off-street parking availability will mean that there is no relationship between your off-street parking requirements and your ability to achieve your on-street parking availability goals. People will always prefer to park on street because it is more convenient. Simply building more and more off-street parking when you already have plenty of it is not going to impact your on-street parking demand. The only thing that impacts on-street parking demand is pricing.
Jeff, I think you hinted at this a little bit, but you said let the market decide. But what about the banks that control so much of the lending, and the developer may not really want to provide all that parking, but he's being forced to? Do you also agree that there should be these parking maximums that always go along, so that to make sure that the market doesn't, because of these other banking influences, provide too much parking?
That's a good question. So we're of firm belief that a one-size-fits-all solution never works for parking, and that you need to make sure that your parking requirements are closely aligned with your own local policy goals as affects a broad array of considerations. So just as minimum parking requirements are a tool that interferes with the private development market in order to ensure that more parking is provided than the market would warrant, maximum parking allowances are another way of interfering with the private development market in order to achieve specific outcomes. Maximum parking allowances reduce your development market just as minimum parking requirements do. So they're a tool that you don't necessarily want to use unless you've got a strong development market. They're also a tool that is effective when you want to make sure that what is being produced is a more walkable, more transit-oriented, more economically vital place. So they can be useful in, for example, a downtown environment or a transit-oriented development area. You probably don't need them in most places in your community. And in many communities, they will not be necessary at all. They should be used rather judiciously. And if you're going to provide them, you should do a lot of market testing to make sure that you don't push them down too low. In San Francisco, for example, which has a very strong development market, the maximum parking allowances in the transit-oriented areas are 0.25 to 0.75 spaces per unit as a key component of San Francisco's affordable housing strategy. Commercial parking is limited to either 0 or a maximum of 8% of gross floor area. So, but that works in a San Francisco context. It would not work at that low of a level in most other contexts in this region. Okay. Well, one more question, then we need to move along.
Can you talk a little bit about how you would handle parking requirements in a transit-oriented district that's just starting, so the walkability is not there yet, and how do you plan for the future but provide for the present?
That is an excellent question. One of the greatest challenges that we face is in the places the places where walkability is just emerging. And so it's tempting in emerging locations to press down the parking allowances in order to ensure that you get a walkable product. But that could have too chilling effect on the development market, particularly for the first players who are in. So if you're in a grayfield or brownfield location, you're the first development out the gate, and there's no place to walk to lunch to yet, employees are going to need to drive. And so oftentimes, the Bay Meadows and Rail Corridor station area plan in San Mateo is an interesting example of allowing developers to build more parking up front and then ratcheting down the parking requirements and allowances as the development proceeds along. Downtown Petaluma is also another fantastic example where they front-loaded the construction of parking, and so that as development came online, none of those developers needed to provide their own parking. And the result of that is, in the theater district, is an extraordinarily walkable, thriving small downtown. All right, so with that, let's keep moving because we've got a lot more to cover. Minimum parking requirements, one of my favorite topics. So as I mentioned before, for most communities, when you're coming up with minimum parking requirements for your zoning code, you do a couple things. Typically, you'll just copy the previous zoning code or copy your neighbors, or you'll go to the Institute for Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Manual, which is this giant tome that has parking data for every imaginable land use and recommended parking requirements, like 1 parking space for every 10 nuns in a nunnery. However, if you look at that data carefully, you'll see, in this case of fast food restaurant with drive-in window, that the data is random. That there's not, in many land uses, a really strong correlation between land use type and parking demand. In fact, as I said before, parking demand varies more by location and by management policies than it does by land use type. And yet, we fix minimum parking requirements at very, very precise numbers based upon very little data, and much of it from Florida in the 1970s. Always better to collect your own data. We've had parking requirements beginning in the 1950s in some locations and becoming ubiquitous in the late 60s and 70s as automobile use skyrocketed in the United States. What we found in the pre-war era was that there was kind of plenty of parking space for horse-drawn buggies and automobiles, because most people were kind of walking or taking the trolleys for most trips. But as automobile usage skyrocketed, there became a crisis of somebody else parking in front of your house or your business. So as growth continued, people solved this critical problem of spillover parking by mandating that more parking be required around your building on your private property than you would ever need as a means of trying to deal with the spillover parking problem. But of course, what we found is that on-street parking is always so much more desirable than off-street parking that regardless of how many off-street spaces we require, the on-street spaces continue to fill up. And those off-street spaces are consuming a lot of land. In a typical kind of transit-oriented development project with a 2.2 parking space per unit requirement, the parking will take up a quarter of the project, having a significant impact on the ability of that project to pencil, as well as the urban design of the place. You're going to have a giant parking structure as part of that. With an adjustment in that parking requirement based upon your own local data, and we find even here in the Bay Area, even in the suburbs, that 0.9 parking spaces per unit is fine, because in fact there are some households, when you go and look at the data, who don't own a car, who want to live near transit, even in the suburbs. In fact, in many cases, even in the suburbs, as much as 30% of households not owning a car. Many of these people are seniors. A lot of them are low income. Some of them are young people who are not interested in driving or who prefer to rent a car share vehicle when they need one. Parking also has a big impact on the landscape. This is another Bay Area community that shall remain nameless that has typical minimum parking requirements. So you have a retail building with its parking, and a medical building with its parking, and an office complex with its parking. And as uses continue on the greenfield locations, you end up with this environment of each use having its separate parking, none of those parking lots being shared, and an entirely auto-dependent development where it is effectively required by law that all trips be by car, including the simplest trips, the 80% of our trips that are not trips to work, that are running errands, that are taking our kids to school. When we look in even more detail, we see that if an office cubicle is about 13 feet by 9 feet, and a parking space is 18 feet by 9 feet, that we're requiring far more area to be set aside for our homes, or for our parking spaces than we are for our homes or for our offices. So why do we mess with the private development market in order to ensure that it oversupplies parking? And what would happen if we got out of the business of overregulating the private development market? Would it be an apocalypse? Would developers never build any parking again? Would people be driving around in circles for hours trying to find an on-street space and getting into fistfights over the ever-dwindling supply of on-street parking? Well, no. What we find in communities all over the country that have eliminated their minimum parking requirements or have adjusted them so that they are truly minimums, that where they reflect the minimum demand for parking rather than establishing the minimums at the maximum demand for parking, that in fact what you end up with is more desirable environments and better economic return on investments. And that's true even here in the Bay Area, cities that have dropped or eliminated their minimum parking requirements. And they've done so not citywide, but in their mixed-use environments where they want to make sure that livability and walkability and transit are prioritized. Again, recognizing that a one-size-fits-all solution does not work for parking. It's also really important in places that are trying to attract a diverse array of residents, particularly educated young people, the new creative class, who are more interested in their social media than they are in car ownership than in previous generations, and particularly communities that want to allow their existing citizens to age in place and continue to have access to all of the community services that exist in the community, that be able to visit their family and do their volunteer work. Older households need less access to abundant parking spaces and more access to transit and to walkability. We also see, as we talk to developers, and Mott Smith will tell you more about this, that parking drives development decisions, and relatively subtle changes in your approach to parking can mean the difference between no economic development in your community and a lot of economic development in your community. And developers are very sophisticated in figuring out what's the right number of parking spaces, just as they decide the right number of bedrooms, the right quality of kitchen appliances, the right window treatments, and so on, in order to target the specific markets that they're after. All of this, however, needs to be thought of in terms of parking's role in a larger multimodal transportation system. Why do we spend so much money ensuring a hyperabundance of free parking for people who drive and not provide the same amount of investment in other modes of transportation? After all parking is a form of access. In our downtowns, it may be more cost-effective to invest in walkability, to invest in more development, to invest in transit improvements, than it may be to invest in yet another parking structure. And so, all in all, what we would urge you to think about, again, is parking's role in achieving your larger economic development, quality of life, social equity, and ecological sustainability goals. So that was a very brief summary of minimum parking requirements. Happy to take some additional questions before talking about parking structures.
You may be perfectly right in what you said about parking, but it was very glib what you said. Tell me what evidence you have. Are there data to back up what you said about not needing so many parking spaces? And are there data other than anecdotal? Are there studies that have been done that demonstrate that your thesis is correct?
That's an excellent question, and unfortunately, given our time constraints, we weren't able to go into the data that is out there. We're fortunate here in the Bay Area that most cities here in the Bay Area have reasonably good data, at least in their downtowns, about their peak cumulative parking demand. Some of the more interesting examples that we have studied in great detail are actually not here in the Bay Area, but in Southern California. And one of my favorite examples is Santa Monica. So Santa Monica, it's in Los Angeles. Everyone drives in LA. It's also one of the highest grossing retail districts in all of California, downtown Santa Monica. What we find there when we go and we actually count every parking space and the utilization rates of all those spaces is that the peak cumulative parking demand for downtown Santa Monica is about 1.6 to 1.7 spaces per 1,000 square feet, even in a place where you would typically predict that the peak cumulative parking demand would be between 5 and 14 spaces per 1,000. And we see these patterns everywhere. In fact, here in the Bay Area, in the Puget Sound region, on the East Coast, in mixed-use environments where you allow parking to be shared, particularly between retail and office, rarely do we see peak cumulative parking demand exceed 2 spaces per 1,000. Similarly, when we go and we look at downtowns, whether it's in Oregon or Florida, or the small number of examples here in the Bay Area, when communities deregulate parking, the developers are still producing parking at almost, not quite, but almost the same rate that they did before. But they're doing more economic development because a relatively small reductions in cost in investment in parking results in the ability for more types of development projects to what we call pencil. So I'd be happy to share with any of you. In fact, there's some case studies in the material in the back of the room that reflects some of the data that's actually out there.
I want to follow up on your consideration of unbundling parking and specifically an idea of instead of charging a resident, for example, for their parking space, having a discount. So what the psychological difference would be if you said, you know, this condo is going to cost you $250,000 and your parking space will be an additional $20,000, or this condo will cost you $270,000, but if you don't want the parking space, it would only be $250,000. Do you think that there is any distinction in that, or do you know of any examples?
So when we look, for example, there's a lot of data particularly from Southern California, about what we call parking cash-out requirements for employers, where all employees get free parking, but employees who don't drive get, $2 a day or $5 a day in exchange for not driving. There is programs like that are effective, but they're slightly less effective, just based upon human psychology, than simply charging for the good like we would any other good in our society. What I continually try to argue for is thinking about parking just as we would any other good in our society. Here in the United States, we use the free market for production and for balancing supply and demand of housing, of food, of clothing, of our cell phones, of our airplane tickets. And we use a Soviet communist approach for the provision of housing for our automobiles. Were we to have socialism in this country, I'm not in favor of it, but were we to have it, I would rather see socialism for housing for people than for housing for cars. Treat it like the commodity that it is. One last question, and then yes.
I wonder if you have any experience with the municipalities actually, through user fees or development fees and charging, owning the parking around transit-oriented development, and then unbundling it to the people who actually drive rather than using transit. Do you understand my question?
I think so. So,
in other words, the city would own the parking and charge for it. A lot like, say, San Francisco does around Union Square.
Yeah. There are lots of different examples. Some of the most effectively managed parking systems in cities anywhere in the country manage parking as a complete system focused on the user or the customer. There are many different ways of organizing this. In the case of Boulder, Colorado, the Downtown Business Improvement Association, the merchants themselves, own and manage and build parking for the whole downtown. And it's a fascinating case study. In other cities like San Francisco, there's a public parking authority that serves the same role and achieves larger public goods. In other situations, private developers will collude in order to manage and supply parking for their collective good. What's interesting about this is it thinks about parking really as an extension of the transportation system. We provide roads as effectively a public utility. And parking is simply an extension of the roadway system. It's your terminal. It's like the train station relationship to the train line. parking is your terminal capacity for your roadway system. So thinking of it as part of that larger system can allow you to think about managing it more effectively as part of your larger transportation system. All right, let's talk about parking structures and keep on time. All right, parking structures are great. They can be an incredibly effective way of being able to provide parking and walkability at the same time by concentrating it together. So you can provide a sufficient number of parking spaces while having lots of development around it and lots of good walkability. But just like with surface spaces and other aspects of parking, parking structures are expensive. And so we need to think about them clearly as we're making decisions about whether to build parking structures or not. As a motorist, there are few things that I enjoy more than seeing a lot of empty parking spaces right in front of where I want to be. But as an economist, every empty parking space that I see is an extraordinary waste of money. Money that could have been spent on something else, whether it be development or wider sidewalks or street trees or lower taxes. Empty parking spaces are throwing money away. And so one of the first rules about thinking about parking structures is making sure that you're making most effective use out of the parking that you already have before you start building anything new. In fact, this is the #1 rule of sustainability. It is always more sustainable to make more effective use of your existing resources than it is to acquire or build new resources. And as I said, parking is expensive. While it only costs about $5,000 per space to build a parking lot, once you factor in the land cost and the operations and maintenance costs and other utility costs, in the suburbs, a surface parking lot costs about $70 to $120 per space per month, or a few dollars a day. And if you're not charging the users for that, what you're doing is you're taxing everyone in order to write a check to people who drive for a few dollars each day to park in your parking lot. In downtown locations where land is more expensive, construction costs go up a little bit, but your land costs and operating costs go up a lot more. And it costs about $300 to $500 per month per space to provide a surface parking lot, or at least $10 a day. $10 to $20 a day is what it costs to provide parking in a downtown. And these are just the hard costs. It does not include any of the soft costs or the externalities or the opportunity costs. These are simple, conservative, fixed, hard numbers. Parking structures cost more in capital, but in a high land value environment, you save so much in the land that you end up saving money in your total monthly costs once you amortize all of your expenses. So it's going to cost you a lot more to build, but the monthly cost is only about $350 to $400 a month. Still a lot, but cheaper oftentimes than doing a surface lot in the downtown. In a suburban location, $25,000 construction, $180 to $300 per month per space. Still, $20 per day to provide parking at, for example, a BART station. That's how much BART is writing a check to the users who drive to BART and want to park at BART. There are very good reasons for providing parking at BART stations and in downtowns, but we have to keep in mind the actual costs that are involved and think about whether there are alternatives for achieving our access goals that are more cost-effective. Lots of cities have realized this, particularly as times have gotten tougher, and they've realized just how expensive parking is. As I mentioned before, Petaluma has long been very sophisticated in its approach to parking, both in the theater district and as it's planning for parking around its new smart rail station, thinking about ways of deferring the construction of parking structures and sharing parking between its retailers and its station users, recognizing that its retailers have peak parking demand evenings and weekends, and the train has peak parking demand Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. They also realize that if they can get train users to park in the downtown and walk, those train users will be walking past their shops twice a day. And so, once again, the first rule of thinking about parking structures is collecting data in your own community to look at parking utilization and to think about, are there ways that we can fill up the empty parking spaces that we already have? Can you look at owners of private parking that have empty spaces? Maybe you can lease those spaces in order to open them up and make them available to other users. Maybe you can help form a parking benefit district or a parking authority, or even get your downtown chamber of commerce to get private property owners to collaborate with each other in order to operate all of the different private lots and garages as a single system with a focus on customers, making sure that there's a parking space available for everyone at all times. And this is, and it's also important to think not only about the actual cost per parking space, but the cost per net space. If you're building a 3-story parking structure on top of an existing surface lot, you may be tripling your number of parking spaces, but the cost per net space is going to be significantly higher than building a parking structure just on a dirt lot. And in addition, you need to think about the revenue side. So it may be costing you a lot of money to build this parking, but if you've managed your parking system right, and if you use the market in order to help you balance supply and demand, you may be able to get enough from fees in order to cover all of your costs. But again, only if you're managing the entire system correctly. And we'll talk about that in the next session. There's some great examples of cities here in the Bay Area and all around the country that have been thinking in a really sophisticated way about their parking systems. Again, downtown Santa Monica is a great example where the city has built 11 parking structures and has done so using revenue bonds, making sure that users are paying the cost of building those parking spaces, and that every single one of those parking spaces is carefully managed so that one can usually find a parking space in most of their garages at all times of day, and that none of the garages is overly empty, that they spread parking demand out geographically by providing good information and setting the right prices for their different garages and for their on-street spaces. Santa Monica, like Boulder, Colorado, also recognized that it was cheaper for them to invest in transit improvements and in walkability improvements than it was to build parking structure number 12. They built a lot of parking, but then at a certain point they realized that they're going to be able to attract a lot more people to their downtown and get those people to spend a lot more money if they spent money on a lush and walkable downtown, much more cost effective than all the parking that they built. Other cities like Portland, Oregon, and Santa Monica as well have realized that in some cases, it's worthwhile to lose some parking space in order to be able to achieve community amenities, like a great downtown public plaza can often be a far more effective way at attracting people into your community than a big surface parking lot. So the question is, given all of the different opportunities in order to make your mixed-use district or neighborhood or downtown work, what's the array of investments that are going to most cost-effectively achieve your larger goals? Sure, you could build a 5-story parking structure and compete against a more auto-dependent environment on a parking space ratio. But if what you're trying to do is to build a more walkable place, it may be better to reduce the parking a little bit, not to eliminate parking, but provide a little bit less parking and a little bit more amenity, like wider sidewalks, like street trees, like street furniture, like playgrounds and parks and bikeability and transit passes for the downtown employees. We should also think about some of the opportunity costs on parking lots and parking garages. If you've got a parking lot or a parking garage, that's not going to be generating any tax revenue for you, and it's not going to be creating more vitality in terms of bringing actual people to your downtown. It's just bringing cars. So think about whether you're going to be better off with a parking lot or a parking garage or development, whether you're a downtown or a transit operator. This is a big question for all of the transit operators, really all over the country right now, is this balance between parking versus transit-oriented development. It may also make more sense to invest in better walkability and connectivity than building parking. If we look at the big transit center up on the Richmond Parkway in Richmond and look at the half-mile radius around that transit center, very little of that half-mile radius is actually within a half-mile walking distance of the transit center, and very little of the 2-mile kind of bikeable radius of the transit center is actually within a 2-mile bike ride, largely because of poor street connectivity in that part of Richmond. So we look in detail, if somebody is living there and wants to get to the Richmond Transit Center, which is right there, you'd think they'd be able to walk 5 minutes in order to get there, but you can't get across the street. So what do people have to do? In order to walk from there, they've got to make a 50-minute walk instead of a 5-minute walk. And as a result, people who live there and want to go to the station there are going to drive, and you're going to need to spend money on parking for them. It may be cheaper to provide a small access improvement than the parking space in order to allow this trip. We also need to think about the systemic impacts of our current approach to parking requirements, where we set minimum parking requirements in excess of demand, so supply exceeds demand. Therefore, you end up with an auto-dependent environment because you're setting aside more space for cars than for people. And that results in a bunch of traffic congestion, air quality, social justice, energy consumption problems. It also results in low demand for transit and walking and biking. So we don't invest in those things because there's less demand, and that produces some problems. It also means that the market price for parking is zero, therefore more people buy cars and park them, and therefore it creates more demand for high minimum parking requirements. And the cycle of automobile dependency that we all experience when we try to drive in the freeways of the Bay Area is complete. If instead we used the market more and revealed the true cost of driving to the people who choose to drive, people are still welcome to choose to drive. I drive, I love driving, but I don't like government to subsidize people driving in front of me. So revealing the true cost of driving makes it easier to drive for those of us who need to drive, and it makes it more affordable to do other choices for people who want to do other things. It also results in more sustainable, more livable, and more economically vital communities. So that's my brief summary about parking structures. Do we have questions before moving on to system management?
Parking structures, what if we were able to convince the retailers, the developers, to actually fund shuttles radiating from the center of the market area and going into the several neighborhoods? And I live in Novato, and I can see that happening. And the government, you know, is broke. But if we could convince the retailers to do this, and I'm sure it's not an original idea, but apparently it hasn't been very, very successful. Am I correct?
There actually are many examples of just that. And in fact, what I would urge all developers and communities to think about when they're thinking about parking is to look at the cost per the cost per shopper, right, of getting people to the commercial district for all modes of transportation. When we look at funding shuttles, it's pretty easy to calculate the cost per net new shuttle rider in order to get to a downtown by improving frequency or upgrading service or adding new lines. That cost varies dramatically depending upon the location. So in places that are of higher density and greater walkability, the cost per net new shuttle rider is much lower than in lower density, more automobile-oriented locations. And the numbers are pretty straightforward to run. So again, in a case like Boulder, Colorado, or Santa Monica, California, developers and the business associations absolutely help fund transit improvements because they see that it's cheaper. In cases, some other cases where the density is lower, in fact, it's cheaper to provide parking than it is to provide feeder shuttle service.
We've done our downtown, reduced parking requirements drastically, but now we're looking at our kind of commercial corridors, transit corridors, and we do have the opportunity, thanks to an MTC grant, to do some surveys and data collection, and we've been talking to Valerie about that, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what we should be looking at, what should we be surveying, any other studies out there that might be good kind of models of what what to look at?
Local data that is tailored to your particular situation is incredibly important. It can also be rather expensive to collect. San Francisco, of course, is extremely fortunate that it got a big federal grant in order to install sensors in its parking spaces that produce an enormous volume of information and data, by the minute parking availability in its on-street parking spaces and its garages that all go into this giant database. But that, cost $15 million, which most cities don't have lying around. And so you need to be rather judicious because oftentimes doing good data collection is very labor intensive if you don't have really good technology. So the things that you'll want to look for are particularly availability by time of day, both in your publicly owned and available spaces as well as the private spaces. Because again, oftentimes it can be cheaper to strike a financial deal with private property owners in order to open up access to empty evening and weekend office building parking than it is to build a public parking structure to serve your retailers. And in all cases, you'll have politicians who are very nervous and community members who are very nervous who will not believe that a more market-oriented approach to parking will result in better outcomes. And so providing the data to them is exceedingly important, as is providing follow-up data to track whether your theory comports with reality. And very importantly, to be able to make adjustments as you go along. I guarantee you that if you make a decision to start charging for parking, you will not set the parking rate correctly the first go around, and it will need to be adjusted continually. You need to make those adjustments based upon data. Other things you'll want to track are, as you change parking requirements, look at its impact on retail sales. You may want to do some qualitative surveys for your merchants as well as your residents, because that qualitative information about how it's impacting my quality of life is just as important as the quantitative information about parking availability. I can send you more information later. There's a lot of stuff to cover.
I had a question about more suburban areas, and particularly, you've talked about surface lot structures, but surface lots we tend to require in most places for, grocery stores, for strip centers, for others, lots of parking as well. Is it important for areas, even though those may not be in as, transit-oriented development areas, but are still places that people could go from their homes for some of their 1-mile trips, to look at the parking requirements for those types of areas, or is it really more a design question, or is it just something that we accept?
The same parking approaches apply in suburban and rural areas as do in urban locations. You're just going to end up with different numbers. In a suburban location, there's even less need to provide minimum parking requirements because no developer would ever build in the suburbs without an appropriate number of parking spaces. In an urban location, you can get away with providing no parking, and you may be able to find a market for that. And that could potentially, if you're not managing your system well, result in a spillover parking problem that could create a political problem for you. So yes, I think that you should look carefully at your minimums. And you may not need to eliminate your minimums, but just make sure that they're actually minimums rather than looking at the maximum theoretical parking demand and establishing that as your minimum requirement, which is what most communities typically do. You don't need to require retailers to build enough parking to accommodate the day before Christmas. What you end up with is a lot of economic waste in the form of empty parking spaces. All right. Let's go into system management, and then we can wrap up. So one of the key issues with parking planning is this assumption that for every different land use, we need a different parking space, and never the twain shall meet. So if I'm at work, I need my work parking space. If I'm at school, I need my school parking space. If I'm at home, I need my home parking space, to the point where there are 9 parking spaces in most communities for every car. Again, ensuring that there's far more land area set aside for our cars than our citizens. And again, every empty parking space you need to look at as wasted money and as an opportunity for creating land value by allowing developers to take advantage of this wastage. You know, go up and look at every single empty parking space in your city and see it as a rich economic opportunity. Most importantly, in order to start thinking about any of changing of rules of minimum parking requirements, we need to first think about managing our existing parking spaces, and particularly focus on availability. So if you take home any message from this presentation, it's that your primary job in establishing parking requirements and managing your parking system is to make sure that everyone can always find a parking space at all times of day. Specifically, you need to manage so that there's a few parking spaces that are empty at all times of day in every parking lot, in every garage, and most importantly, in every block face of on-street parking. When you look at any community, parking demand is going to vary more by geography than by land use type. Downtown Redwood City, California was an early pioneer in getting smarter about parking. I don't know if you all are familiar with what Redwood City looked like in the 1980s and in the 1990s, but it was probably the most tragic downtown on the peninsula. A lot of boarded up buildings, very poor economic return, and yet you couldn't find a parking space. Why? Because parking was free, and employees from one store would park across the street and vice versa. So that employees were filling up all the Main Street parking spaces, customers couldn't find a space, and the downtown was performing poorly. The city decided, all right, in order to create availability, we need to charge for parking, and the merchants said, you know, heck no, we will go out of business if you charge for parking. Thus began lots of arguments and discussion, community process, the end result of which was a very sophisticated approach for a small town downtown that priced parking in the core of the city at a higher rate than a block away, providing free parking at the edge where there was plenty of availability, higher parking rates on street than off street, but more importantly, they legislated that about 15% of parking spaces shall be available at all times, and staff is responsible for establishing the management techniques that are necessary for achieving the availability target. If your goal is to achieve parking availability for your customers, you are far better off legislating an availability target and managing to that target than you are in legislating an off-street minimum parking requirement. Again, if you've got off-street availability already, simply requiring more off-street parking is not going to solve your on-street parking availability problem. And again, Santa Monica has taken a similar approach. And for both Redwood City and Santa Monica, in addition to thinking about system management and pressing parking demand out geographically to make sure that a few spaces are all available, they most importantly took a customer service approach. If any business on your main street only accepted quarters for a coffee or a book or whatever it is that they are selling, they would quickly go out of business. If you're going to be charging for parking, you need to make sure that all of your parking meters accept forms of payment that everyone has on their person. They all need to accept credit cards and debit cards, and they all need to call you up on your cell phone and ask you if you want more time. All new meters do this. Get rid of your quarters-only parking meters. I can't believe they still exist. Why on earth would you criminalize a shopper who's decided to spend more money in your downtown than she initially expected? And that's what we do with parking citations. You're criminalizing people who are spending more money and more time in your downtown than they had originally anticipated. Allow your meters to call her up on her cell phone and say, yeah, like I want to spend more time here. And also, as we've said before, keep in mind that parking for cars is just one way of getting people into your downtown. So provide lots of information and provide everyone, lots of alternatives, and provide everyone with information about that full array of alternatives that are available to them. If we look at how we're typically providing for parking now and managing that parking, all of you have a big ugly arterial in your communities. So imagine that is whatever big ugly arterial you've got. And here's how we typically provide development along that arterial. You've got school and shop and work and play, and our minimum parking requirements that are separated by land use ensure that there are separate parking lots, and those parking lots are bigger than our land use. And you imagine a typical trip. So dad drives Sally to school, drops her off. That requires a parking space. Then he goes to work and he parks there. And then he's got to go on his lunch break to pick Sally up and drive her across the street to soccer practice, because of course she can't walk herself across the big ugly arterial. And then he goes and he does some shopping, he picks up the groceries, he goes and he picks Sally up, and off he goes home. And obviously, this is a much compressed, idealized sort of trip, but it's the sort of thing that many of us do every day in our lives. And it's a mess, right? And not only is it a lot of driving, but it's a lot of turning movements off of our big arterial, turning movements that are having a disproportionate impact on congestion. So imagine instead we have the same arterial, but we've got a grid of streets, and many of you have a historic downtown that does just this, where you arrange development along your main street and you share parking so that parking takes up less space, and some of it is surface and some of it is structure. Now imagine the same trip. Dad drives Sally, he parks, Sally walks herself to school while Dad goes to work, and Sally can now walk herself across the skinny street in order to get to a soccer practice, and Dad can easily pick up the errands at lunch, and they can meet together at the car, and off they go and they go home. This is the exact same trip, but radically different results simply because of the way that we've arranged land uses and dealt with parking. 1/2 of the parking is necessary, and this is based upon real data from communities here in the Bay Area. Less than 1/2 of the land area, or twice as much economic development capacity for the same amount of investment and the same amount of traffic. 1/4 of the arterial trips, 1/6 of the arterial turning movements, and less than 1/4 of the vehicle miles traveled, a 75% reduction in traffic, simply because we've arranged land uses and parking focused on the pedestrian rather than focused on a single parking space for every trip. Again, this is a driving trip. There's no transit in this equation, and this is exactly how communities like Santa Monica, like downtown Palo Alto, like even Mill Valley operate. Much greater economic development opportunity per unit of traffic congestion and per unit of land area. And again, I want to emphasize that while all of these principles in general are applicable to a full array of community types, you need to tailor each of them to your own local conditions, your own local data, and very importantly, your own local political acceptance. Because while all of these ideas may make sense technically, it's a lot of work, as Mayor Bates and as Matt Tacker will tell you, in terms of actually doing implementation. But again, remember that what works in one part of your community will not work in another part of your community. A one-size-fits-all solution for parking never, ever works. Another key point that I want to leave you with is if you do decide to go on the adventure of charging for parking, the right price for parking is always the lowest price at which a few spaces are always available. You charge for parking never to make more money for your general fund. You only charge for parking in order to create availability for customers. This needs to be a mantra. You can never in public say that you're charging for parking in order to solve your budget difficulty. You will always make more money off of a successful commercial district than you ever will off of parking fees. You charge for parking in order to create availability for customers, and lo and behold, what happens? If you charge the lowest price, at which a few spaces are always available, not only will your businesses do better, but you also make more money off of your parking meters. If you were to charge less for parking, all of your parking spaces fill up and customers are driven away, resulting in less return on your business district. If you charge too much for parking, then you will have too many empty parking spaces and customers will be driven away, and you will not make enough money off of your parking meters. If you charge the right price for parking, everyone is happy. And it's remarkable to me how we understand these principles for every other commodity in our society, but we do not for parking. Again, I want to emphasize the critical importance of smart, easy-to-use, customer-friendly payment technology as well as information technology in order to help your customers find a space. In most downtowns that we've looked at, As much as 30% of the traffic in small town downtowns with mismanaged parking is people driving around in circles trying to find a parking space. If you want to eliminate your traffic congestion problem, no cheaper or more effective means than simply managing your parking as you would any other commodity. And the result, of course, is not only greater economic vitality for your downtown, more revenue for your city, more development opportunities for communities that want to grow, but much more livable, fairer, and ecologically sustainable places. There's more detail in the back about other tools that are available, including transportation demand management tools. Mayor Bates mentioned many of those, unbundling free transit passes, emphasizing both conventional as well as peer-to-peer car share, tools for increasing the efficiency of parking, allowing mechanical lifts or tandem parking as of right. Why do you care if a developer provides non-independently accessible parking? As well as a whole variety of very detailed tools about managing the parking spaces that you've got. With that, it's time to close. I'd be happy to take a few more questions before we hear from Mott Smith and from Matt Tacker.
The way you're proposing that people analyze this is no different from what has been done in many other technological areas. So a question to you is, I don't know this area very well, but there must be companies that see this as a good niche for making money. Can you provide a list of companies that will go in and do a systems analysis for a community and advise them on how to proceed this, looking at all the different feedback loops to continually change variables in order to meet the conditions you mentioned?
Yes, there are a variety of companies. Of course, I can be very self-serving and point out that my own company, Nelson Nygaard, does this.
We want a good company.
Exactly. I would also point out that here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I have the greatest respect for some of my competitors. We've got a tremendous amount of talent, both on the consulting side, but also on the municipal and developer side of people who are really figuring all this stuff out and who can take a systems approach to dealing with parking. And well, maybe Valerie would be a more objective authority for providing you with a list of those folks.
We certainly fund some of the studies here, and there are a wide array of consultants who do an excellent job on this.
Other questions?
Have you seen examples of retailers unbundling the cost of parking for shoppers, or is that seen as too risky financially?
The retailers are sort of the last frontier for really thinking about unbundling parking, except in the shared parking environments. So in rather urban locations, and again, I think Santa Monica is a great example, as well as downtown Boulder, Colorado, where the merchants have pooled resources in order to fund shared parking structures throughout their downtown. That's all retail parking, and it's all priced. And they set the price so that customers can always find a space. In lower density environments, particularly where retailers are very sensitive to the fact that they're competing against the automobile-dependent environments, they're having a harder time. But what we're seeing increasingly, and maybe Mott in his presentation can provide more examples, is very conventional retailers realizing that even suburban downtowns are a tremendous market opportunity that is underserved and missed, and that in order to have walkability and customer access at the same time, they have no choice but to set the right price for parking, because otherwise you end up having your parking expand out too much and destroy the walkability that attracted you to that location in the first place.
What examples, what cities were you referencing?
Well, so some of this happens on a very formal basis in the form of downtown business improvement districts or parking authorities forming with private property owners organizing themselves in order to create a very formal authority that they own and manage themselves. So Boulder is actually my favorite example because they're so sophisticated at thinking about downtown access across all modes of transportation as they seek to attract more customers. It also occurs on a more informal basis. Really, in most downtowns here in the Bay Area, the private property owners will sometimes collude simply with their neighbors in order to strike deals. Walnut Creek is a great example of that, where there are many, many parking owners, but one large private parking operator. And so many of the private parking owners contract with this parking operator in order to manage the system from a customer perspective while making sure that their customers and their employees can always find a space. So I think on a more informal basis, locally, Walnut Creek is a good one. There are probably many others as well. Is that it? All right. I'm afraid we are out of time. We'll kind of turn it over to the next speakers, but we'll have some time after the session in order to do some more questions and answers. Thank you all.